Alleluia. Christ the Lord is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. This is the announcement of Easter. Today we learn that 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, Salome, go to the tomb where Jesus was laid as soon as they came out after observing the Sabbath. They went, Mark tells them, to anoint Jesus' body. One last act of love and faithfulness to give their Lord the final burial rite. They were, of course, expecting a closed tomb and a dead body in it. They were also caught up in the concern over how they might roll away that heavy, very large stone covering the tomb's entrance. No doubt their hearts were still deeply sorrowful over the death of Jesus. They will miss him terribly. They would feel as if their world had come to the end without him. What future did they have now without Jesus? But lo and behold, they were wrong. The stone was already rolled away and as they arrived to the tomb. What could this mean? Did someone steal the Lord's body? Where would they do now? Who would do such a thing? Summoning up as much courage as they could, they entered the tomb. Most likely, they were expecting to find nothing in it except darkness. Instead, they saw a young man dressed in white sitting there, as if he were waiting for them and expecting them. When they saw him, Mark tells us, they were alarmed. To be alarmed in such a circumstance is not unusual, is it? Like most of us, we would be too. After all, throughout the Bible, whenever an unexpected messenger from God appears to someone, they usually have to reassure them with the words of comfort like, "Don't be afraid, fear not." The same is true here. The messenger of God in white begins the revelation to the women by speaking those words of comfort, "Do not be afraid." Then he tells them who they're looking for as well as how he died, Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. But the story doesn't end there. The women, however, are likely not to hear the messenger of white, what he's going to tell them next. He has been raised. He is not here. Then, to drive the point even further, he invites the women to look around that empty tomb so they can see for themselves exactly where Jesus' body had been laid. However, the young man in white concludes his revelation by now giving the women instructions to go to tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Then comes the finale. The earliest, most reliable manuscript of Mark's gospel ends with verse 8. Mark tells us, "So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." That's it. The end. What a way to end the gospel, isn't it? It's the only one of the 4 gospels to end so abruptly without the women sharing the good news. Most, if not all of us, would be with a happy ending, don't we? The ending here in verse 8 is full of uncertainty. We're left with that nagging question of, why did Mark end his gospel this way? Why does Mark not give us an account of the risen Jesus appearing to the women? Where is the message of good news and triumph to be found in such an ending? One clue that verse 8 gives us is in those contrasts of words employed to describe the state of the women. Terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It may be instructive that the word amazement also translates to astonishment, often as associated with actions and words of God and Jesus in the Bible. It's a word that has a connotation of both sense and dread before the holy presence of God and Jesus, as well as a sense of surprise and being attracted to God and Jesus through the sense of wonder and fascination. By describing the women this way, Mark may very well be emphasizing to his audience that this is a divine relation of God. In stressing the very human response of the women to God's messenger and his message, does Mark not make the women more real and believable? How many of us would not respond like those women? All the gospel resurrection accounts mention either the element of fear and doubt as response to the risen Christ. It's most likely required time for women to deal with their fears and doubts, first because they were able to go and proclaim the good news of the risen Christ to the other disciples and Peter. When God speaks to us or calls us, the same thing is true. We don't always respond in faith. At first, we may be afraid and even skeptical about it. We may need time to deal with this, integrate into our lives as we are able to respond. Obviously, the women did not remain silent and fearfully permanently, for they had no one in there that day to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. Another aspect of Mark's ending, which is consistent again with the other resurrection accounts, is that the women, not the men, are the first messengers of the resurrection. It's quite ironic, for at that time in history, it was clearly a man's world. Only men were allowed to be legal witnesses. Men, not women, held positions of authority. Yet God breaks with this human-made tradition by giving the good news of the resurrection to the women first. They become the first preachers of the resurrection. So ultimately, Mark's ending then is a word of encouragement to his original audience and to us. He gives us the message that there is hope for ordinary people like you and me. We may not be perfect. We may fail sometimes miserably. And what do? We may continue to wrestle with our fears and doubts, yet the good news is that Christ is risen and God still works to draw people into his church. Christ is risen to give us a new beginning. Christ is risen to remind us that God of life is more powerful than death. The God of all goodness is more powerful than evil. The God of love is more powerful than fear and hatred. And the God of faith and hope is more powerful than doubt and despair. That is why the church still exists after all these centuries, and that's why we're here today to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus in our lives today. Alleluia! Christ the Lord is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. Amen.